9 years ago, if someone had asked me what happiness looked like, I'd have described the life I shared with Megan. We had it all, or so I thought. Our modern house in Calgary wasn't just a home. It was a symbol of everything we'd built together. I ran a successful transport company, Megan was a well-regarded dentist, and our son Ethan brought joy to our lives every day. We hosted barbecues for neighbors, took family vacations to places people dreamt of, and donated generously to local causes. Everyone saw us as the golden couple. Behind closed doors, we shared laughter and dreams about the future. Or at least, we used to. Things started to change gradually, almost too subtly to notice. Megan became more distant. At first, I attributed it to stress at work. She began staying late at the clinic, often coming home well past dinner. Patient emergencies, she'd say, and I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She'd never given me a reason to doubt her before. Then there was her wardrobe, new clothes that were tighter, more revealing. She told me she wanted to feel confident again after hitting her mid-30s, and I didn't think much of it. I wanted her to feel good about herself. But there was something else, a disconnect. Conversations felt forced, our connection thinning with each passing week. At times, I wondered if it was my fault. Had I been too focused on the business? Too tired at night to talk? The thought gnawed at me, but I pushed it aside. Megan and I had been through tough times before, and we'd always come out stronger. This was just another rough patch. At least, that's what I told myself. For all appearances, our life remained perfect. Ethan, our 7-year-old, was thriving in school and soccer. He was the center of my world, the one thing that kept me grounded when work became overwhelming. Every day, I reminded myself I was working hard to give him the life I never had. Looking back now, I see the signs were all there, scattered like breadcrumbs. But back then, I didn't want to see them. I couldn't imagine my wife, my partner of nearly a decade, being capable of something that would destroy the foundation of our family. If only I'd known what was coming. If only I'd paid closer attention. Maybe then, I could have stopped it before it tore my life apart. It wasn't one big thing that tipped me off. It was the little details that piled up, one after the other. Megan's late nights became more frequent, and her explanations grew vaguer. Paperwork ran late, or a last-minute patient came in. She had never been one to dodge questions before, but now her answers felt rehearsed, like she was telling me what I wanted to hear. I tried to shake off my unease. I didn't want to be that guy, the paranoid husband who doubted his wife without reason. Yet, I couldn't help noticing how she avoided eye contact when I asked about her day or how her phone never seemed to leave her side. If I walked into a room, she'd quickly lock it and tuck it away. That wasn't like her. Megan had always been open, leaving her phone on the counter or handing it to Ethan to play games. And then there was the way she acted around Ethan. Normally, she was affectionate and engaged, but lately, she seemed distracted. She'd sit with him during homework time, but her attention would drift, her eyes glued to her phone as she half-heartedly nodded at his questions. Ethan noticed too, asking me once, "Is Mommy mad at me?" I reassured him, even though I wasn't sure myself. I told myself I was overthinking things. I even talked to a buddy of mine about it, expecting him to laugh and tell me I was crazy. Instead, he gave me a look I didn't like and said, "Sometimes, when your gut's screaming, there's a reason." That comment stuck with me. The nagging feeling grew stronger, especially when Megan started spending extra effort on her appearance before leaving for work. New perfume. Hours spent fixing her hair. Dresses that hugged her in ways that turned heads. She had always been beautiful, but now it felt like she was dressing for someone else. Still, I didn't want to accuse her. What if I was wrong? What if it really was just work stress, and I was jumping to conclusions? But the doubts kept clawing at me. I told myself if I had proof, real, undeniable proof, I'd confront her. Until then, I'd wait. The opportunity came on a Thursday afternoon. I had a free hour between meetings and decided to surprise her at the clinic with lunch. It felt like a good way to reconnect, to remind her, and myself, of what we had. I picked up her favorite sandwich from the cafe she loved and drove over. The clinic felt oddly quiet when I walked in. The receptionist smiled and told me Megan was in her office. As I approached, I heard muffled voices behind the closed door. Laughter, hushed and intimate. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Should I knock? Wait. Something in me snapped, and I opened the door. The room was empty. At first glance, it looked like she'd just stepped out. But then I saw her desk, and the photo sitting there. My chest tightened as I picked it up. It wasn't just a photo, it was Megan in a pose that made my stomach churn. Her pants were pulled down, and she was sitting on her desk, legs spread provocatively. The background confirmed it was taken right there, in the office I was standing in. I couldn't breathe. My gaze shifted to her phone on the desk, screen still unlocked. Against my better judgment, I swiped through her messages, my hands trembling. The texts confirmed everything, explicit messages between her and someone named Jacob. They talked about their meetings, laughed about the photo, and reminisced about their adventures at the clinic. I don't remember leaving the office. I just remember sitting in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Anger and humiliation bubbled up, but more than anything, I felt hollow. I drove home in a daze, the sandwich still sitting untouched on the passenger seat. That night, as Megan came home and kissed Ethan on the head like nothing had happened, I realized everything had changed. My world had been ripped apart, and she didn't even know I knew. But she would. Soon. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the day over and over. Megan was asleep beside me, her breathing steady, as if nothing was wrong. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. How long had this been going on? Was I blind to it, or did I just refuse to see the signs? I wanted to confront her right then and there, shake her awake, and demand the truth. But every time I thought about it, my chest tightened. I wasn't ready, not yet. I needed to figure out my next move, not just for myself, but for Ethan. The thought of him getting caught in the middle of this mess was unbearable. The next day, Megan acted like everything was normal. She packed Ethan's lunch, kissed him goodbye, and waved as he left for school. I watched her, wondering how someone could smile so effortlessly while carrying such a dark secret. It felt surreal, like I was living with a stranger. I didn't go to work that morning. Instead, I drove around aimlessly, trying to calm the storm brewing inside me. Every time I thought about that photo, my blood boiled. I kept imagining Jacob's smug face, the way they laughed about their little secret while I was out there working my hardest for our family. The betrayal cut so deep I could feel it physically, like a knife twisting in my gut. Eventually, I parked in a quiet lot and pulled out my phone. I scrolled through the messages I'd taken photos of at the clinic. Reading them again was like pouring salt on an open wound, but I needed to. I needed to remind myself this wasn't a misunderstanding or some minor slip-up. This was a deliberate, calculated betrayal. I stared at Jacob's name in the messages. He was younger, 27, according to one of the texts where Megan teased him about being a baby. That only made it worse. I pictured him sitting in her clinic, smirking as they plotted their little trysts. He wasn't just some random fling. He worked with her. He was in her world every single day, right under my nose. I felt sick. I had to do something, but what? Part of me wanted to storm into the clinic and drag Jacob out by the collar. Another part wanted to expose Megan for who she really was, tell the world about the woman behind the perfect smile. But a quieter voice inside me kept reminding me of Ethan. Whatever I did, he'd have to live with the fallout too. That evening, Megan came home late again, claiming she'd been stuck finishing up a root canal. I didn't say much, just nodded and focused on Ethan as he told me about his soccer practice. Megan barely seemed to notice my silence, which only made me angrier. She was so wrapped up in her double life that she didn't even realize her world was crumbling. I decided to wait a little longer before confronting her. If I was going to do this, I needed to do it right. I needed undeniable proof, not just for myself, but for when everything came to light. So the next day, I did something I never thought I'd do. I called a private investigator. The PI, a no-nonsense woman named Janet, listened to my story without judgment. Her professionalism put me at ease, even though I felt like my entire life was unraveling. She assured me she'd get to the bottom of it. If there's more to uncover, she said, we'll find it. The waiting was the hardest part. Every time Megan left for work, my mind filled with images of her with Jacob. I avoided touching her, avoided meeting her gaze, afraid I'd give myself away. She didn't seem to notice, though. If anything, she seemed more distant than ever, texting on her phone more often and smiling at something I couldn't see. When the first report came back from Janet, it hit me like a freight train. Photos of Megan and Jacob entering a hotel together. Records of long phone calls during times she claimed to be working. My heart shattered all over again, but this time, it wasn't just anger or sadness. It was humiliation. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the life we'd built, the family we were supposed to protect. Still, I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed to make sure she couldn't twist the truth, couldn't manipulate her way out of it. I asked Janet to keep digging. At night, I lay awake, running through every possible scenario. How would she react when I finally called her out? Would she deny it? Would she blame me? And then there was Ethan. How would I protect him from this? He didn't deserve any of it. As the days stretched into weeks, my anger hardened into something colder, sharper. Megan thought she was in control, but she had no idea what was coming. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to make sure she understood the gravity of what she'd done. Not just to me, but to our family, to our son. The perfect image she'd worked so hard to maintain was about to come crashing down. After the PI's second report, there was no denying it. Megan had betrayed me on every possible level. The evidence was overwhelming. More texts, more photos, more hotel visits. All of it spelled out in cold, hard facts. But what struck me most wasn't the physical betrayal. It was the way she talked about me in those texts. In one exchange, she laughed with Jacob about how clueless I was. He thinks I'm just working late. It's almost too easy, she had written. That one sentence burned itself into my brain. For all the years I had spent building a life for us, she saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to work around. I wanted to storm into the house, throw the evidence in her face, and let the chips fall where they may. But every time I thought about Ethan, I held back. He was just 7, innocent, unaware of the chaos swirling around him. I owed it to him to think this through, to make sure the fallout wouldn't destroy the only stable life he'd ever known. Instead, I started planning. The first step was gathering everything Janet had uncovered. I needed an airtight case, one Megan couldn't deny or manipulate. I compiled the texts, the photos, and the hotel receipts into a single folder on my computer. I also printed out hard copies, just in case. The second step was figuring out how to protect Ethan. I didn't want him to be collateral damage in this war. That meant thinking ahead, about custody, about his school, about what would happen to him once Megan's world came crashing down. I couldn't let her selfishness ruin his childhood. I also started preparing myself for the confrontation. I rehearsed the conversation in my head, trying to anticipate every excuse, every lie she might throw at me. She'd probably try to blame me, say I was too busy with work or that I didn't pay her enough attention. But I wouldn't let her rewrite the narrative. Despite the anger boiling inside me, I kept up appearances. At home, I acted like everything was normal, smiling for Ethan and making small talk with Megan. It was exhausting, but necessary. If she suspected I knew, she might try to cover her tracks, and I couldn't risk losing the upper hand. She didn't make it easy. Every time she left the house, my mind went into overdrive. Was she meeting Jacob? Was she lying to my face again? It took everything I had not to follow her, not to confront her right then and there. But I stayed patient. If I was going to do this, I had to do it on my terms. There were moments, though, when my resolve wavered. Like the night she came home late, smelling of that new perfume she always wore. She sat next to me on the couch, her hand brushing against mine as if nothing had changed. I could feel my chest tightening, the rage bubbling just beneath the surface. But I forced myself to stay calm, to act like I didn't notice. Ethan, thankfully, was oblivious to it all. He was my anchor during those weeks, the one thing that kept me grounded. I spent as much time with him as I could, taking him to soccer practice, helping with his homework, and tucking him in at night. Every smile, every laugh reminded me why I had to see this through. By the time Janet's final report came in, I was ready. The evidence was damning, more than enough to expose Megan for who she really was. But this wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about justice, about making sure she understood the full weight of what she'd done. The calm before the storm was over. It was time to take back control. The evening I decided to confront Megan felt heavy, like the calm just before a thunderstorm. Ethan was already asleep, and the house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Megan was sitting in the living room, scrolling through her phone, completely unaware of what was about to happen. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind for days. Still, as I walked into the room, my heart pounded like a drum in my chest. The folder of evidence was in my hand, every page a reminder of the life she had destroyed. I stood in front of her, blocking her view of the TV. She looked up, surprised, and asked what was wrong. "Megan," I said, my voice steady but firm. "We need to talk." Her expression changed immediately. She sat up straighter, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she sensed something serious was coming. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice laced with cautious curiosity. I placed the folder on the coffee table and slid it toward her. "Open it," I said. She hesitated, her eyes darting from the folder to my face. When she finally opened it, her expression shifted from confusion to shock. Her hands froze mid-turn as she stared at the photos, the texts, and the receipts. For a moment, she didn't say a word. Then, almost predictably, the lies began. "This isn't what it looks like," she said, her voice trembling. "I can explain." I cut her off. "Don't. Just don't." My voice was sharp, but I kept my emotions in check. "I've read the texts. I've seen the photos. There's nothing you can say that will make this okay." Her face crumpled, but I wasn't sure if it was guilt or the fear of being caught. "Liam, I swear, it wasn't serious. It was just a mistake. A lapse in judgment. A mistake." I repeated, my tone icy. "You've been sneaking around for months. Don't insult me by calling this a mistake." She started to cry, tears streaming down her face as she tried to spin her web of excuses. She claimed she'd been feeling lonely, that I was always busy with work and didn't make time for her. She said Jacob had been there for her in ways I wasn't, that he made her feel wanted. Every word felt like a slap in the face. I wanted to shout, to let the full weight of my anger crash down on her, but I stayed calm. "So instead of talking to me, you decided to blow up our family?" I asked. She didn't answer, just buried her face in her hands. Her sobs filled the room, but I didn't feel pity. Not anymore. When she finally looked up, her eyes were bloodshot, her voice desperate. "We can fix this, Liam. Please. I'll end it. I'll do whatever it takes. Just don't give up on us." I stared at her, struggling to recognize the woman I had married. "The only reason I haven't thrown you out yet is Ethan," I said coldly. "He deserves better than this mess you've made." She flinched at my words but didn't argue. For once, she seemed to understand the gravity of what she'd done. I didn't sleep that night. While Megan cried herself to sleep in the guest room, I sat in the living room, staring at the remnants of a life I thought I knew. My anger hadn't subsided, but something else had taken its place: resolve. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. If she thought an apology and a few tears would fix things, she was dead wrong. She needed to face the consequences of her actions, and I was going to make sure she did. The confrontation was only the beginning. Megan's tears and apologies rang hollow, and I knew she wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was just sorry she got caught. That realization hardened something inside me. If she was willing to destroy everything we'd built, I wasn't going to make it easy for her to move on. She had ruined our family, and now it was time she felt the full weight of her choices. The first step was ensuring Megan couldn't sweep this under the rug. The next morning, while she tiptoed around the house trying to act normal for Ethan, I made calls. First, to Janet, the PI. "I want everything you've found organized and ready to use," I told her. She assured me that the evidence was ironclad. Next, I contacted Megan's clinic. Her boss was a no-nonsense type, someone who valued professionalism and discretion. I sent the folder anonymously, making sure to include the photo taken in her office and the details of her affair with Jacob. By the end of the day, I received confirmation that the clinic's board had been alerted. Megan's name and Jacob's would be the center of an internal investigation. When Megan came home that evening, she was pale, her hands trembling as she put her purse down. I didn't have to ask. She'd already heard. "Liam, did you?" she trailed off, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't respond. I just gave her a long, hard look and walked out of the room. I wasn't going to waste words on her anymore. The fallout came quickly. Within days, Megan was called into a disciplinary hearing. I didn't know the exact details, but I heard enough through whispers in our social circles to piece it together. She tried to deny the photo's significance at first, claiming it was private and unrelated to work. But the messages sealed her fate. The clinic had no choice but to terminate her, citing a breach of their professional conduct policies. Jacob wasn't spared either. He was fired just as swiftly, and the news spread through the local dental community like wildfire. It wasn't long before he realized the extent of the damage. When he tried applying for other positions, my network of business contacts ensured he'd hit a dead end at every turn. Nobody wanted to hire someone with a scandal attached to their name, especially not in a field as interconnected as theirs. Megan confronted me about Jacob one night after Ethan was asleep. "Why are you dragging him into this?" she demanded, her voice trembling with anger. "He didn't deserve this. This is between you and me." I stared at her, barely able to contain my contempt. "Deserve this?" He slept with another man's wife in her workplace and laughed about it behind my back. He made it my business. If you're looking for sympathy, You're not going to find it here. Her face twisted with frustration, but she had no argument. She'd made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. The damage extended beyond her career. Word of the affair leaked into our social circles, thanks to the clinic staff who couldn't keep it quiet. Megan's friends stopped calling, neighbors avoided her, and the once friendly glances she got at the grocery store were replaced with whispers and judgmental stares. Megan had always loved being the center of attention, basking in the respect and admiration of our community. Now, she couldn't even walk down the street without feeling the weight of her actions. As for me, I didn't gloat. This wasn't about petty satisfaction. It was about justice. She had torn apart our family, betrayed my trust, and jeopardized our son's stability. Now, she was reaping what she'd sown. Through it all, Ethan remained my priority. I shielded him from the drama as best as I could, making sure he didn't overhear the arguments or sense the growing tension in the house. It wasn't easy, especially when Megan started lashing out, accusing me of being vindictive and spiteful. Think whatever you want, I told her one night. But remember, you started this. You chose to betray us, not the other way around. Her response was silence, but the look in her eyes told me she hated what she had become. That was fine by me. She needed to face the reality of her choices. I knew I wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. Megan thought she could cheat and move on unscathed, but she was learning the hard way. Actions have consequences. And I was only getting started. Ethan had always been perceptive for his age, but now, his questions were sharper, more probing. "Why does Mom look so sad all the time?" he asked one evening, sitting on the couch while I helped him with his math homework. His wide, innocent eyes searched mine for answers I didn't know how to give. I smiled weakly and ruffled his hair. "Mom's just going through a tough time, buddy," I said. "But everything's going to be okay. You don't have to worry about that." But he did worry. How could he not? The house had become a battlefield of cold silences and forced smiles. Megan tried to overcompensate, showering Ethan with extra attention, which only seemed to confuse him more. He didn't understand why she was suddenly at home so often, or why she didn't seem as confident and happy as she used to. The strain began to show in other ways. Ethan became quieter at school, his teachers mentioning he seemed distracted during lessons. His soccer coach pulled me aside after practice one day and asked if everything was okay at home. "We've noticed Ethan's been a little off lately," he said gently. "Nothing serious, just not his usual self." I nodded, my throat tightening. "Thanks for letting me know. I'll keep an eye on him." It was like a gut punch. No matter how hard I tried to shield him from the fallout, it was bleeding into his life. That realization brought a crushing sense of guilt. Megan had detonated the bomb, but I wasn't innocent. My quest for revenge, though justified, was leaving scars on the one person who mattered most. At home, I began to focus even more on Ethan. I took him out to the park, played board games with him, and made his favorite meals. Every laugh or smile felt like a small victory. Still, the shadows of what was happening loomed over everything. Megan, for her part, was unraveling. The weight of her tarnished reputation, the loss of her career, and the cold reality of our crumbling marriage were taking their toll. I often found her sitting alone in the kitchen, staring at her phone or holding back tears. One evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, she approached me in the living room. Her face was pale, her eyes puffy from crying. "We need to talk about Ethan," she said, her voice trembling. I set down the book I'd been pretending to read and gestured for her to sit. "Go ahead," I said. She hesitated, biting her lip. He's noticing everything, Liam. The tension, the silence. He's too young to understand what's going on, but he knows something's wrong." "I know," I replied, my tone calm but firm. "I've seen it too." Megan's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away. "I never wanted this to affect him," she whispered. "Then you shouldn't have done what you did," I said bluntly. Her head snapped toward me, anger flickering in her expression, but it quickly dissolved into despair. "You think I don't regret it? Every single day, I hate myself for what I did. But hating me won't fix this, Liam. It won't fix him." I sighed, leaning forward. "You're right, it won't. But the damage is done. All we can do now is make sure Ethan knows he's loved and that none of this is his fault." Megan nodded, wiping her eyes. "So, what do we do? How do we move forward?" I looked at her, my heart heavy. "We'll figure it out," I said, though I wasn't sure what that meant. As the days passed, I tried harder to maintain a sense of normalcy for Ethan. I took him to school every morning, helped with his homework, and made sure he felt supported. Megan, too, seemed to make an effort, though her attempts often felt strained and hollow. One night, as I tucked Ethan into bed, he wrapped his arms around my neck and whispered, "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, buddy," I said, my voice thick with emotion. It was moments like that that reminded me why I was fighting so hard to hold things together. But deep down, I knew the storm wasn't over. The damage had been done, and the only question now was how much more Ethan would have to endure before we found some kind of peace. And peace still felt a long way off. By now, Megan's world had crumbled, but it still didn't feel like enough. She'd lost her job and her standing in the community, yet Jacob, the man who had played an equal part in this disaster, had simply disappeared. I knew I wouldn't find closure until he faced the consequences of his actions. I started digging into Jacob's life. He'd already been fired from the clinic, but that wasn't enough for me. I wanted him gone, for good. I reached out to contacts in the local business community, quietly letting them know about Jacob's behavior. The photos, the texts, the scandal, it was all ammunition. The results came quickly. Jacob had applied to several clinics in the area, but thanks to my network, every door he knocked on was slammed shut. A friend in HR tipped me off. His reputation's poisoned now. Nobody's touching him. Still, he wasn't gone yet. Megan, desperate to salvage what little dignity she had left, had been in contact with Jacob. She claimed it was to tie up loose ends, but I knew better. She'd always been one to cling to the remnants of something she couldn't have. I intercepted one of her phone calls with him. I wasn't proud of it, but I needed to know what he was planning. Jacob's tone was bitter, frustrated. "I can't stay here anymore," he said. "It's impossible to find work, and I can't afford to wait this out." Good, I thought. A week later, I heard through the grapevine that Jacob had packed up and left town. No job, no prospects, no support system. He was running, tail between his legs, and it felt like justice. Megan, however, wasn't as relieved as I was. One night, after Ethan had gone to bed, she confronted me. "You did this, didn't you?" she accused, her voice shaking. "Did what?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "Don't play dumb, Liam. I know you're the reason Jacob can't find work. You ruined his life." I stood up, my patience wearing thin.
"I ruined his life."
"He's lucky that's all I did. He slept with another man's wife, Megan. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences?" She crossed her arms, her face a mix of anger and guilt. "It wasn't just him, Liam. I made mistakes too." "Mistakes?" I snapped. "You didn't make a mistake, Megan. You made choices. Choices that destroyed our family. Don't expect me to feel sorry for Jacob when he played just as big a part in this as you did." She didn't say anything after that. She just turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the living room. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. Jacob was gone, Megan was facing the consequences of her actions, and I still had Ethan. But even as I told myself I'd won, a part of me wondered if this was really victory, or if I just burned everything down and called it justice. At least now, Jacob was out of the picture. One less complication, one less threat to the fragile peace I was trying to build for Ethan and me. But the war wasn't over yet. There was still one more battle to fight. Custody. And I wasn't going to lose. The divorce process began quietly, almost too quietly, like the eye of a storm. Megan avoided arguments, likely sensing that she had no ground to stand on. The evidence of her affair, and her role in the upheaval of our lives, left her vulnerable. But I wasn't looking for a fight. My goal was simple: protect Ethan. I met with a lawyer, a sharp but empathetic woman named Angela. After explaining the situation, I handed over the evidence I had gathered. The photos, the texts, the investigators' reports. Angela nodded thoughtfully as she reviewed it. "This is substantial," she said. "It will certainly help your case, especially if you're seeking full custody." "I am," I replied firmly. "Ethan needs stability, and Megan. She's not in a position to provide that right now." Angela laid out a plan. The evidence would support my case for primary custody while giving Megan limited visitation rights. It wasn't about punishing her, though part of me felt she deserved it, but about doing what was best for Ethan. Megan, to my surprise, didn't put up much of a fight. When she received the custody filing, she looked defeated, as though she knew this was inevitable. "Do you really think I'm a bad mother?" she asked one evening after Ethan was asleep. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I think you made choices that hurt our family," I said carefully. "But this isn't about punishing you. It's about what's best for Ethan. Right now, he needs consistency and stability, and I can give him that." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. For once, she seemed to understand the consequences of her actions. The court process moved swiftly, thanks to the overwhelming evidence in my favor. Megan was granted visitation rights every other weekend, but I was awarded full custody. When the judge announced the decision, a wave of relief washed over me. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. Ethan adjusted surprisingly well. I worked hard to keep his routine as normal as possible. School, soccer, family movie nights. He still saw Megan, but those visits were carefully structured to avoid disrupting his sense of security. Megan, however, struggled. She moved into a small apartment across town, a far cry from the life we once shared. The community's judgment weighed heavily on her, and I could see it in her eyes every time she came to pick Ethan up. One night, during a quiet moment after Ethan had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room, reflecting on everything that had happened. The anger that had driven me for so long was beginning to fade, replaced by a deep, hollow sadness. I had won the battle for custody, but the war had left scars, on me, on Megan, and most painfully, on Ethan. As much as I wanted to move on, the weight of the past lingered, heavy and unshakable. Still, I resolved to focus on the future. I had Ethan, and he was my anchor. I couldn't undo what had been done, but I could rebuild, one step at a time. The paperwork was finalized a few weeks later. Megan and I were officially divorced. As I signed the last document, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. The chapter was closed, but the story wasn't over. The next step was learning how to live in this new reality. A reality where betrayal had broken my family, but where I still had the chance to be the father Ethan deserved. It wasn't going to be easy, but for him, I'd do whatever it took. Life after the divorce wasn't a clean slate. It was more like walking through the ruins of what once was, trying to rebuild while stepping around the broken pieces. Ethan was my constant motivation, the reason I pushed myself to move forward even on the days when the past felt unbearable. Megan's visits with Ethan were cordial, though strained. She made an effort to show up on time, to smile for his sake, but there was always an undercurrent of tension between us. I caught her staring at me sometimes, as if trying to gauge how much of the man she had betrayed was still left beneath the surface. I gave her nothing. Ethan seemed to be adjusting, though he had his moments. Once, after a soccer game, he asked why his mom didn't come to see him play anymore. I told him she was busy and left it at that, even though the truth was more complicated. I didn't want him to carry the weight of our mistakes. He was just a kid. I threw myself into parenting, doubling down on my efforts to be present for Ethan. We built Lego sets together, went on fishing trips, and read bedtime stories every night. It wasn't just for him, it was for me too. He grounded me in a way nothing else could, reminding me that there was still good in my life worth fighting for. But there were quiet nights when the weight of everything crashed down. I'd sit in the living room, staring at the empty spot on the couch where Megan used to sit, and wonder how we'd ended up here. The memories, good and bad, were like ghosts, haunting the edges of my mind. I went to therapy, though it took weeks to admit I needed it. The therapist, a calm and patient man named Robert, helped me untangle the knot of anger, sadness, and guilt I carried. He reminded me that healing wasn't about forgetting the past but learning how to live with it. Your anger served a purpose, he said during one session. It gave you the strength to act, to protect yourself and your son. But now, you need to find a way to let it go, or it'll consume you. Letting go wasn't easy. There were days when I still wanted to lash out, to remind Megan of everything she'd lost because of her choices. But there were also days when I felt pity for her. She'd lost her job, her reputation, and the life we'd built together. She was trying to pick up the pieces, just like I was, but her path seemed lonelier, heavier. One evening, while going through old photos, I found one of the three of us at the park. Ethan was just a toddler, grinning wildly as Megan and I held his hands and swung him between us. I stared at it for a long time, the memory bittersweet. That version of us was gone, but Ethan was still here, and he deserved my best. As the months passed, I started to find moments of peace. Small victories, watching Ethan score a goal at soccer, laughing together over a silly movie, or even just a quiet evening reading a book, became the foundation of my new normal. Megan and I barely spoke outside of co-parenting conversations. She had tried once to apologize again, saying she wished she could undo everything, but I had cut her off. We can't change the past, I'd said. The only thing that matters now is Ethan. And that was the truth. My focus was on him, on giving him the stability and love he needed to thrive. There were still scars, of course. Trust didn't come easily anymore, and the idea of letting someone new into my life felt impossible. But I was learning to live with the wounds, to let time and effort slowly stitch them together. One day, Ethan asked me if I was happy. The question caught me off guard, but I smiled and ruffled his hair. "I'm happy when I'm with you, buddy," I said, and I meant it. Because despite everything, I still had him. And in the wreckage of my old life, that was more than enough to give me hope for the future.